So I just want to welcome you to our webinar today. This is part of the Dennis C. Miller Spring 2020 webinar series. And today we are talking about transforming how you select and manage your workforce talent and what every nonprofit CEO and HR executive needs to know. So I will get started. If you haven't already, just please turn your webcam off and set your microphone to mute so we don't have a lot of interference. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the program. You can post your questions by clicking on the chat box, and feel free to either ask your question publicly, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can do so privately. Just address it to Dennis Miller host, and I will see it and make sure that we get to your question at the end of the slides. We also will circulate a recording of the webinar, so if you have to pop out for any reason, or there's something that you want to really take a look at again or listen to again, by all means, know that we will be sending that to you. And we'll also include our contact information later. So if you want to contact us directly, you can do that. My name is Michele Hickey. I am Executive Vice President of Dennis Miller Associates. I've been working with Dennis for about 15 years. As much as I'd like to say that that's exactly the time that I started working in nonprofits, I can't. I've been doing this work for about 25 years, and I have worked with a wide variety of organizations, from higher education to performing arts to healthcare, large, small, and everything in between. So I think I have a fairly broad perspective on how nonprofits work and what some of the issues have been over the years that I have seen. I'm happy to introduce my co-presenter today, Anthony Pantaleone. Anthony is with our partner in providing data-driven assessments for hiring and developing personnel, Talexes Talent Solutions. Anthony has more than 30 years of experience in behavioral assessment. He is such an expert in this field and has so much to share with you that you're going to find helpful. And I was also very impressed recently to learn that he is pursuing a master's degree in human resources management with Rutgers, which I give him kudos for finding the time and energy to do that. When we conceived of this webinar, it were things like lockdown and mass unemployment were not really on our radar quite yet. At that point, employee turnover for nonprofits was actually running neck and neck with that of for-profits at about 19%. But at that point, 35% of nonprofit organizations were struggling with staff turnover. Although we don't know what's going to happen in the coming months and the next few years, I think it's safe to say that staff turnover will not disappear. There will always be reasons that people feel that they need to move. And even if you take job satisfaction out of the equation, people relocate to other states or other parts of the state, they retire, they decide to change direction in their careers. So there's always going to be some turnover in any employee-employer situation. Now, of course, we are in very unique and unprecedented times. So more than ever, Anthony and I have talked about how important it is to be looking ahead and to be considering what variables we can manage. I happen to feel, I don't have experience in for-profit corporations, but I feel like the issue of staff turnover is especially hard on nonprofits. Most nonprofits that I've ever come across are already operating with a very lean staff. More than half report struggling to find enough resources. It's just a chronic issue. So our point in working with Talexes and in providing this webinar is to do what we can to help nonprofits be as effective as possible. And the other reason for this is that Dennis and our team, we feel that nonprofits are more important than ever. When a nonprofit is unable to fulfill its mission, the people they serve are going to suffer, and we don't ever want to see that happen. So one of the questions that I think comes up, or whether it's spoken or not spoken, is whether or not it's worth investing in an ongoing program of employee recruitment and retention. And I think we have to give a lot of validity to that question, because nonprofits are working with a very tight budget. So we're going to try to help you figure that out. And, is this a place that you should be budgeting for and thinking about every year? So the first question to ask yourself, is your staff chronically overwhelmed? Do you find that your staff is struggling to find and maintain its direction? And thirdly, do you have an employment talent management plan that begins before you would make a hire, and that takes that employee into consideration for as long as they are with your organization? And finally, do you have the tools that you need to manage through the certainties and uncertainties of a post-pandemic environment? And we'll get to that again later. First, I want to take a look at the cost of employee turnover. Obvious costs, we can all think about job listings and ad fees. And, even with a lot of the free online things, if you want to place an ad in a really smart place, like the job board of a professional association and so forth, those things cost money. And frankly, sometimes a little more than I expect to see. There's the staff hours that go into recruiting and interviewing. It may be professional recruiter fees if you decide to go that route with your hiring process. And there are also the necessary screenings. Getting a background credit, it costs money to get diploma verification. All of these things have a cost attached to them. Now, while all of that's going on, there are probably going to be tasks that go undone of varying importance. What report doesn't get filed? What donor cultivation activity doesn't happen because you are so short-staffed? At some point, that's going to lead to a loss of revenue. And it's also going to affect employee enthusiasm. When staff members are constantly asked to pick up for a staff vacancy, they get overworked, they're going to feel overwhelmed, they're going to burn out, and guess what? They're going to be looking for a path out the door, which is only going to aggravate the issue. I think we also have to consider the long-term impact. When you're constantly being reactive to your hiring and your staffing needs, you're going to have trouble consistently aligning your talent with your strategy to achieve your mission and vision. And the reality is, things are going to change. We're going to have to be more responsive, dynamic, and adaptable than ever before. So it's going to be really important to have people who can be fully on your team and fully aligned with you as you do that. So our feeling is it's always the right time to invest in hiring, in employee training and development, and in retention. And I think Dennis would agree with me in the work that he has done with nonprofits. This is what the high-performing nonprofits are doing. This is part of their thinking at all times. So not everybody's there yet. I guess one of the things that we see a lot is organizations settling when they make a hire just to fill a position. And Anthony and I talked about this, and I call it the ugly chair syndrome. It's sort of like when you have a new apartment and people are coming over and you really need a chair. And so you go out and buy the first thing that you find and can afford, and you get it home and it serves the purpose for that event. But now you've got this chair that you don't like very much and isn't particularly comfortable. But now you end up keeping the chair for another 5 years until you finally get around to replacing it. This is what happens over and over again when you're not making the right hires for your organization. And it's not the chair's fault, just as it isn't the employee's fault. People fail or become unhappy and leave not because they are inadequate, but because they simply don't match the jobs we're hiring them to do. Anthony puts it that we hire on confidence and we fire on fit. And there are ways to do a better job of fitting the people to the job. It's important to build on your strengths. I think we often lose sight of the fact that our staff is our greatest asset. We spend a lot of time focusing on building that new building and getting the new equipment and all the other pieces of what our organizations need to do their job. But the staff is where we should really be paying attention. We can help with this, and actually Anthony will talk more about that in a little while. But there are ways to be more assured that you're hiring right and that you're developing and retaining your employees and putting good processes in place to deal with shifting. This last item is really up to you. You need to make it the priority to ensure that your people and your organization are growing together. You have 3 points in the continuum to fix your people problems. You can either hire right at the outset. You can retain your employees by coaching them and training them. And I think that's something that I often see get lost. Investing in your current staff to grow into larger roles is always a good investment. The third chance you get is replacing them. I can guarantee that if you pay more attention and invest in the first 2, you won't have to invest so much in the third. If you're approaching your recruitment and hiring the same way you did 10 or 20 years ago, which is what I kind of think of as advertising, interviewing, hiring, and onboarding, then you have every reason to consider a new way of looking at talent management. Before you even draft your job description or place an ad, it is really worthwhile to spend some time determining what's required for success in the role that you're looking to fill. And it's not just about what someone needs to do, but in the context of your organization, how you hope that they will approach their role. It is important to always be sourcing candidates internally and externally. You don't want to wait until you have a vacancy to be placing an ad and just taking everybody who happens to answer your ad. You want to be out there meeting people. You also want to be taking a critical look at the people that you have with you. It should never be, how could I put this? You never want to hire someone and put them in their role and say, okay, that's done, there they are, because everyone wants to grow. Everyone wants to learn new things, and everyone has capacities for more than what they're currently doing in their job. So you want to be looking internally and externally for people who may join your organization at some point in the future. You want to have a really top-notch interview process, and you want to have an assessment for job match. You want to know with as much certainty as you can that you are hiring someone who's going to be successful in their role. It might be worthwhile, actually it is worthwhile, to before there's even a vacancy, to identify your high turnover areas. Take a look at your system for hiring. Is this something that you do just when you need it, or is this a function that is incorporated into your strategic thinking? Take some time to understand the jobs at your organization. Develop and review your job descriptions regularly, not just when you have to include it with a grant application. And there is a way to do this, and again, Anthony is going to talk more about this. It is possible to determine the right kind of person for a job by identifying the shared characteristics of your top performers. Again, always be sourcing candidates. One of the things that Anthony and I talked about is that, organizations spend a lot of time promoting the organization through social media and other methods, and with the goal of attracting volunteers, attracting donors, attracting clients. Think about that promotion that you do also as a way to attract potential new employees. I mean, people want to work at a place that they feel good about, that they can be excited about. So make sure that you're projecting that at as much as you can and as often as you can. Consider new sources of candidates, people who, perhaps organizations that are looking to place veterans, people, higher education programs that happen to work with a lot of career changers. There's an organization I work with that hired a career changer. He was in marketing, and now he is doing programs, service learning programs for homeless youth. And he's doing a fantastic job. And because he has this marketing and business experience, he's just an awesome role model for them. So think a little creatively, think out of the box when you're looking at who might be a good candidate. And finally, don't rule out, I'm saying candidates, but people who aren't yet looking for a new role. The vice president at another organization might be, looking for an executive vice president role somewhere else. Or, they might not be looking for a new position now, but when they do think that they might want to move on, wouldn't it be nice if they thought of you and reached out for advice, and possibly you could make a match there. Know your best practices for hiring. If you have an HR professional on staff, look for their advice on that. And there are also organizations like the Society of Human Resource Management that can help you know what best practices for interviewing are. Having an agenda and timetable. You want to also be spending time building rapport, getting to know how you might work with this person. This is, I think, important, being consistent across candidates. I think it's a great idea. And Dennis and I, when we do executive recruiting and interviewing, we always have a matrix so that you're asking each candidate for a position the same questions. This way, when you're trying to evaluate, you're kind of comparing apples to apples. Listen to what they're saying, listen to their questions, and answer their questions about the position as much as you describe the position, and make sure that you're discussing next steps. Learn what you can and can't ask. There are rules, and sometimes they vary from state to state. So just make sure you know which questions are appropriate and which are not. Do follow up and keep candidates informed. Don't ghost them, even if it's a lot of work. I think it, again, speaking well of your organization, and word gets around when you haven't had good manners, is what I like to call them, in keeping in contact with people. When you do your reference checks, ask the basic questions, but also consider what questions might be specific to the role that you're trying to fill. And also, again, be consistent. Ask the same questions. If you're doing reference checks on 2 or 3 candidates, make sure you're asking the same questions. So again, you have some way of looking and comparing to see how, to see across this consistent set of issues. Plan for background checks and drug screenings and whatever other legal things. And I think actually a lot of times your insurance company can help you decide what the necessary checks are, and confirm licenses, degrees, and also consider doing a bit of a social media scan. I mean, it's hard to be completely extensive with something like that, but it doesn't hurt to at least do a scan of the basic websites just to make sure there are no red flags. So at this point, I am going to bring in Anthony, who is going to talk to us about what Talexes can offer with regard to database decision making.
Hi, Michelle, and thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone out there. Thanks for being a part of our webinar this afternoon. I hope everyone is well. So having the opportunity to work in the industry my entire career, I've worked with a lot of different industries and a lot of different organizations, but particularly I've had the opportunity to really get to know your space, the nonprofits, and working with Michelle and the DCM team. So I've really come to appreciate what your specific challenges are. So I hope that I can share some great ideas with you today. But in my experience, really what assessments will help you with is really two areas. One, driving more efficiency in your organization and aligning expectations. And with traditional processes, like what you see here, I'm sure everyone has probably made at least one decision or two. And I kind of say that a little kiddingly, where you hired someone and they didn't work out or they didn't live up to your expectations. And we never make those decisions consciously, right? I mean, we consciously expect that they're going to work out and contribute, but then we often kind of scratch our heads wondering why. And traditionally, when we're making decisions, we're really dealing with a limited view. Traditional resume, education, past experiences, all that information is great. It's a good decision point, but it's very limited and flawed. So what we want to do today is really provide you with some tools and additional ideas. And as Michelle mentioned, encourage everyone to incorporate more data in your decision making so your decisions will be built in more of a solid manner. Many hiring managers rely on intuition versus data. It's just kind of how we're wired. It's important to incorporate objective data into decision making. And there's even some research in the industry where it points at the fact that when you do give hiring managers the appropriate tools and allow them to make the final decision, they're going to rely on data more readily. So when you have the opportunity to go below the surface and lift that iceberg out of the water, you can incorporate more of a diversified approach. So you will be able to understand and mitigate some of these unseen potential risks. And as Michelle mentioned earlier, there are soft costs as well. So these risks are costly, like loss of productivity. So you have the loss of productivity on the departing employee because maybe now, as they're departing, they're not as productive as they were. And then you're going to have the loss of productivity from the vacancy. And lastly, there is that time period where now you're trying to bring a new employee up to speed, and they're not really, operating at 100% as well. So you have a lot of those soft costs that come into play that we often overlook, but they do have a real impact on our operations, as you all know. This is a very interesting study that was published in the Harvard Business Review. And in this study, what they do is they look at what practices correlate with job performance. And if I can draw your attention to the bottom, it says job experience. And job experience has a very low correlation with performance on the job, believe it or not. And then as you start to incorporate more objective data into the decision making, as you can see, they start to increase the probability of being able to make those correlations and predicting those outcomes. All the way at the top, you can see what happens when you use a multi-measurement test. And what we mean by that is using a test that encompasses having a cognitive measurement, personality, and interest. When the multi-measurement test is used, it has the highest correlation to on-the-job performance and enabling you to be a better predictor of job performance and job success. So by incorporating a data-based diversified approach, you have the opportunity to add more predictive information into your whole framework. When you add more of a predictability into your decision making, your odds are going to improve. your outcomes will improve, and you'll be able to mitigate many risks that are inherent in a traditional process. This is another great resource by the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor actually recommends providing and utilizing more data in your decision making via testing and assessment. And a lot of times testing and assessment is really used interchangeably in the field. So we like to say assessment because a test is more like people do good or bad, and really an assessment isn't about doing good or bad. It's really assessing the person in relationship to the context. So we like to use the word assessment, but they're usually used interchangeably. But the whole premise here in this resource, and kind of looking at adding this type of approach to your current framework, is that you're looking more at the whole person. So you're still relying on traditional practices, but now you're blending them and integrating them with more data so you can leverage that and look at the person holistically and make your decisions accordingly. So here's an example of a multi-measurement test. It's broken into those three categories that the Harvard Business Review research referenced earlier. So the first area is thinking, which is a cognitive measurement. And this type of assessment looks at cognitive because not only is it very important in terms of predicting job success, but it's very important when it comes to providing awareness and understanding. And what I mean by that is, I remember working with an executive earlier in my career, but the story always stands out with me. And he was a type of executive that would score really high on reasoning ability, and very quick to assimilate information, very strategic, and just kind of had that skill. And when we took that person through the assessment, we went over the results, the aha moment didn't come from revealing to him that he was so high in his cognitive ability. It came by looking at that person in relationship to his team, because his team was more kind of like in the middle range. And it doesn't mean that if someone scores in the middle or lower range, they're unintelligent. It just means they process information at a different rate, and they have different strengths, compared to someone who scores at the higher rate. But what happened with this executive is he then realized that the way in which he goes about his day-to-day communicating and interacting with his team was actually not empowering them. It was actually a friction point, because he was very quick on his delivery. He would very rarely speak with people and sit down and kind of spend the time to walk through a situation. It was always kind of like a rolling walk or a stand, something quick and standing. And as we went through this exercise, the staff revealed to us that they were often intimidated by the person because of the way in which he delivered. So now we had immediate impact from an awareness standpoint and then application, because the executive now was able to change the way in which they work with their team immediately. So the day after, they started to incorporate those changes, and it improved performance, morale, and they had a better working relationship. So not only does the information provide great insights on the pre-hire, but it also provides great insights when it comes to post-hire and improving performance and awareness. The next section is personality. So personality is really what measures how we conduct ourselves in the role in question and in certain contexts. So it's really kind of like how we're hardwired. So we don't change, but typically we will look at how someone is hardwired, because that drives consistent behaviors, which ultimately drive consistent performance. And if we can get to the root of those behaviors and align those with the performance expectations, we have a winning combination. But we can also be very well served when we understand the gaps, so then we could be proactive and address those. And then lastly, the interest section provides us with an understanding as far as where is the person motivated? Where are their interests? How can we engage that person in their role or on a project or with their team? So having this type of objective data-based reference can really bring you very far down the road in terms of getting to know someone and making confident decisions in a consistent way. In my opinion, assessments are great, but if you understand the context across these key areas, they'll provide an even greater impact. And what I mean by that is having an understanding as far as how a person fits their job, which is, a lot of times kind of like, our main focus, right? But we also want to take a look at how they fit the team, how they'll fit their manager, and how they fit the culture of the organization. Because if you don't take these different elements into consideration, you're going to have friction points that will develop down the road. And those friction points could really be the start of why people don't work out and why there might be conflict in organizations. So it enables you to stay ahead of the curve and be able to be proactive with potential risk across these 4 key areas. Now, the power from a multi-measurement test comes from what it measures and the ability to provide relevancy to your application. So in this example here, now we take this multi-measurement and now we look at it in a specific context of the job. So this is called a success pattern, or also known as a benchmark. And what that represents is a range within each of the scales that are measured. So you know ideally what you're striving for in relationship to a role. And let me provide an even a better example with the next slide. And this is an actual situation that I got to work on with the DCM team, where we were looking to help an organization with a chief development officer. And this particular client engagement was kind of straddling the pre and post pandemic. So we had a conversation kind of like pre-pandemic, and we developed these parameters, and then we revisited it post-pandemic because things were going to change, as we all know, and we all will be encountering with many roles in our nonprofits, because there are going to be hybrid roles. People are going to be doing, perhaps more. They're added responsibilities. So we're going to be doing more with less. And every single one of those roles will bring about robust conversations in terms of what is the new normal. And we had an opportunity to kind of share this with you as a real life scenario, because we think that everyone would really relate to this. So the role is a chief development officer, and just to kind of talk you through some of the kind of rationale behind these ranges within the scales, I think would be very interesting. So first off, on the reasoning side, the reasoning ability scale, the cognitive measurement, we talked a little bit with our client pre and post, and that pretty much stayed the same. That reasoning ability was going to need to be in that kind of mid to higher range, because the individual needed to be strategic and a multitasker, and they just needed to have that kind of like inherent hardwiring. So that kind of remained the same. But now when we start to get into the personality, that's where we had some interesting adaptations. So for example, the manageability. So manageability in this kind of 5, 6, 7 range is like a mid to high range. We needed the individual to appreciate structure, but yet be more adaptable. So I think that was something that really came up in the conversation. And Michelle, you even mentioned that earlier in terms of people needing to be more adaptable in general. Now, it doesn't mean that if someone scores an 8 or a 9, doesn't mean that like they can't be adaptable. I mean, they can, but we have to remember that every day, each and every one of us stretches beyond our core traits, our hard wiring. And we do that through learned behaviors. And a lot of times when we do that, we employ emotional fatigue. So at the end of every day, depending on how far we had to stretch and how often that day, that emotional fatigue sets in. And when we have to do that every day over the course of weeks and months and even years, it becomes draining on us, right? So we will have a tendency to resort back to our core. So when we can look at the alignment in a natural way, it provides kind of that situation where someone is highly engaged and they're not tapping themselves. So in this situation, the manageability kind of settled into that mid to high range. The next scale would be people contact underneath manageability. Now this was interesting because traditionally this role was high in people contact because that's what chief development officers do. They're energized by working with people and networking and building relationships, maintaining relationships. But my, how things have changed overnight. Now this role will require someone to have a little bit more time working in solitude. So we had to ratchet that back in this new normal. So people are now in this kind of mid-range of people contact, or I should say the ideal candidate will be in this mid-range. Next is the attitude scale. So here's a very interesting conversation. The individual revealed to us that the chief revenue officer is going to be working side by side with the rest of the executive team in being able to accurately, and the operative word there is accurately, right? Accurately be able to project what type of funding expectations they will be exposed to. So how will they kind of fund these expectations? How accurate will this be? Because as you all know, the worst situation is when we're off, right? And we don't want that to happen. So we want the individual to not be so high in attitude where they're so optimistic and naive and hopeful that they're relying on hope as their strategy. We wanted that person to be more vigilant and skeptical and kind of use that to the strength in this role because we wanted more accuracy in that type of projection. So that kind of came into this unique conversation with the client. The top of the scale there, competitiveness. So this was interesting because we want individuals to be competitive. We want them to work towards revenue goals, but we also want them to balance that so they're not too overbearing. So that kind of mid to high range was the desired range. And then sense of urgency was another important discussion point because as we work closer to our goals, we can't start ratcheting the urgency factor up. So as we get closer to the end of the year, the end of your fiscal year, whatever that may be, we can't start ratcheting the urgency to meet these revenue goals. We need to be urgent every step along the way. So we needed someone to be inherently wired that way. So their sense of urgency is kind of in that mid to high range. And then lastly, we wanted someone to be in that moderate to high range for take charge because we want them to feel comfortable in not only managing through obstacles, but managing up as well. Because this doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the chief development officer in terms of these goals. This person needs to be able to solicit the help of the entire executive team at times in order to accomplish these goals. So we need someone to be kind of wired for them to naturally be inclined to solicit that type of help and manage up. So I hope that was interesting for you. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes into these, but very interesting when you're able to have this type of granular conversation in the context of an objective tool and then create something that's very customized for you and your organization so the context is spot on. So once your success pattern is established, now you have the opportunity to administer the assessment to your candidates. So perhaps your shortlist, and you have the opportunity to see how the candidate aligns with this definition of success, this objective reference point. And in this case here, you have someone who scores a 92% fit with the success pattern. So the kind of call out area here is the person scored a 3 in competitiveness. We needed them to be a little bit higher, like in that 5, 6, 7 range. So it could be something that is worth exploring. Here's another example, another candidate on the short list, and this candidate has a 66% match. So you can see here there are going to be more inherent challenges that are hidden below the surface. And here's the thing, you wouldn't be exposed to these inherent challenges until you hire the person, and then you start to observe them in the role, and weeks, months go by, and then you're kind of in that period where expectations aren't being met because the person was able to kind of morph into the person they thought you wanted them to be, during that interview process. And now we're starting to see kind of like, that iceberg coming out of the water. You're seeing some of these inherent risks. So now when you have an opportunity to look at the candidates side by side, I'm sure as you look at these two candidates, you'll easily see which one has more of the risk associated with them. And please know this, we never take the position that you're making a decision solely on an assessment. You're using an assessment as part of the whole person approach. But if all other things were, pretty equal as far as experience goes and education and so forth, now you have a very important insight that you're bringing into your decision making. And in this situation here, you can see the real potential consequence of the 66% match. And also know this, that these core traits drive consistent behaviors. And the key question is, will those behaviors be congruent with the performance expectations? And the way you will know that is because behaviors ultimately drive skills, and skills ultimately drive competencies, and competencies ultimately drive performance. So when you look at it from a core trait perspective, you'll see the potential fall off here. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the assessments are not a be-all end-all, but they're a very important data point. So you may have these two final candidates, the 66% match and the 92, and you may continue to explore how they fit those 4 key areas: the context of the job, the context of the team, the reporting relationship, and the culture, by utilizing the assessment in a follow-up interview, which is really where it provides another element, another layer of value. So in this example here, what we do with the interview questions that are focused on the gaps is we provide the hiring manager or panel of hiring managers with information that they can use to understand more about the candidate in this context. So in this example, the person is wired to be an 8 and take charge. We define the role as a 5, 6, and 7, so they're not too far off, but it's still worth exploring. So now you have the opportunity to incorporate some of these interview questions into your dialogue to understand how this person might behave. And what I always like to say, it helps you understand the candidate's level of conscious awareness. Because if I'm an 8 and take charge and I provide answers that convey to you that I'm emotionally aware and I've managed that, and here's how I do it, then you'll feel pretty good about that score in relationship to that range. But if my answers are actually like oblivious to that, then that'll be another important data point for you, because that's the part that you won't know until the person's hired, and then you start to see where the fall off occurs. Here's another interesting dimension. So if I can draw your attention to this visual here, number 3 is Joe King. So ask yourselves, if you were to add Joe King to your team, how would that impact your team? And then if I may go even a question further, if you were to add Joe King to your team and you needed Joe King to change the status quo, what would that mean to this team? So if you needed Joe King to drive innovation for your nonprofit and to really look at things differently, especially in a post-pandemic new normal, is this going to be not only a good hire for the role, but for the team in order to drive this change? And you can see Joe is high in competitiveness, high in people contact, high in take charge. And there may not be a right or wrong answer here, but hopefully I've given you something to ponder, because I know every single one of the participants here today is probably either encountering a decision like this right now, or you're about to encounter it in the weeks ahead. And it'll be a very important insight for you to have access to, I'm sure. One of the best ways to impact performance and scale best practices throughout your organization is by embracing a coaching culture. And in my experiences and work with many different organizations through the years, I've always found that, leaders, they want to be great coaches, but, they tell me, Anthony, I just don't know what to say at times. I don't know the context. I just don't know what to focus on. So I keep it more operationally, or I keep it more on process and the business side, but I don't get into, really the soft skill side much. And whenever we're able to empower, managers and leaders with information so they can get to know their direct reports and know specifically what they can do to work with someone, their confidence skyrockets. And ultimately, like the executive example we shared earlier, when he was high in the cognitive measurement and he had that awareness, and then he now had tools to work with his team. These are the tools. And in this example here, we look at that person who's an 8 and take charge. They're a little bit higher than the position calls for. And then the insights explain what that means. And then the management suggestions provide that leader with prescriptions on how they might coach that person. So thinking a little bit about, Mr. or Miss Sample, what might you do differently in this situation as you're about to prepare for this team meeting, or you're about to present to the board on this subject? So it gives you the opportunity to have a constructive dialogue in a relevant way. This feedback is really popular. It was very popular pre-pandemic because of the diversity of our workplace and how individuals want to take ownership of their own development. And Socrates, said it best way back when. He said, know thyself and imagine thyself. So we get to incorporate know thyself and imagine thyself into the conversation here by constructing feedback that you can give back to an individual. And we don't want the individual to get hung up on the measurement. So you're an 8 and take charge, and you need to be a 5, 6, and 7. At this point, that's irrelevant. That's for the hiring manager. That's for the selection decision or for the management and coaching approach. But now, in order to create this kind of like multi-stake in the development plan, you need to empower the individual as well. It can't just be one-sided. So by providing feedback to the individual that's concrete, that specifically references the role and what they can do, you can see these development suggestions will go a long way in terms of building that individual's confidence and, I believe, changing their whole career trajectory within your organization. There are many benefits from a quantitative and qualitative perspective in terms of implementing testing and or assessments into your decision-making processes because of the fact that they provide more data. And having a data-driven approach will enable you to be more consistent with all your decision-making across the talent management framework. And that will ultimately align with your organization's strategic vision.
Thank you, Anthony. That was so helpful. And I think everybody, I kept getting notes about how much they were really getting from what you've been telling us.
Oh, my pleasure, Michelle.
I want to do just a couple of quick public service announcements. We still have 3 more webinars coming up. They are all free of charge, but registration is required. So up next week is our Susan Hairston talking about crisis funding. So I hope you'll be, if you haven't already, that you'll be signing up for that before the day is out. I'll be looking for your registration. If you'd like to take a deeper dive in doing everything that you can to improve the performance of your nonprofit organization, we have 2 online courses: how to become a high-performing nonprofit board and how to become a high-performing nonprofit executive leadership team. The link below, you can subscribe. It's a 6-month subscription for each course. The video run time is about an hour for each, but it's broken into modules so you can take them, in smaller bites. And there is a workbook that is included with each course. And now we're at question and answers. You can also, before I forget, don't forget to go to www.denniscmiller.com for a whole load of resources, blogs, recordings of webinars, and more. But I do have some questions that have come in already, Anthony. So, and feel free to add a question to the chat room. But the first question I think is really, really important. People are asking, what is the process for developing a success pattern?
Oh, sure. So that process is really multifaceted. Basically, we use either one particular approach or a combination of approaches, but just from a high level perspective, one approach, like in the chief revenue officer example that we shared, would be really where you're having a conversation around each scale in the context of the expectations for that role in that environment, right? So it becomes really personalized from, the CEO's perspective, the board chair's perspective, when they're kind of looking at this critical role for the organization. And then what are they looking for? But then most importantly, what are they looking for that complements the current team, right? Because what might work for one nonprofit might not work for another, because you have different talent within each organization. So that conversation becomes very specific and customized, and it's really just having a conversation in the context of the tool, kind of like having a job analysis type question in the context of the instrument. The other methodology, which often proves to be really interesting, is as you go like, downstream into some of the individual contributor roles, management roles, then you could start to look at like a core group of individuals who are consistent performers for you. We can assess them and we can actually look at their shared characteristics. And then we can develop a customized benchmark around their shared characteristics. And a lot of times what that does is it provides you with an insight as far as like, what are those characteristics that align to the role, to the culture, to the team, to your environment right now, and help you to clone and duplicate that for the future. So that's oftentimes really a very interesting exercise as well. And sometimes it could even be a combination. We could assess your exemplars and then have this conversation around what was the role and what do you expect the role to be, and then kind of make those adjustments as we go. But ultimately, the process is really interesting to go through because it helps you in kind of like looking at the expectations, current and future.
Right. So here's a question. It's can these talent assessment tools help me determine if my managers and leadership team are having a positive or negative impact on staff retention?
I mean, there are a few different ways to like get to that that measurement, right? So I've often seen that assessments can move the needle across many different areas, performance, retention, et cetera. When you try to get a feel for what is the root cause of why people stay or leave, and if job fit, awareness, communication, if all those are kind of friction points, then an assessment can certainly bring value to the organization, because you're touching upon providing awareness not only to the organization from a decision-making standpoint, but to the individual. So you have the dynamics of kind of like it's a two-pronged dynamic there. And then as you start to cascade that awareness through the organization, it becomes part of your culture. So that impacts it, because then everyone is like reinforcing each other in terms of, hey, I understand that, hey, I'm high and take charge and my colleague isn't. So I'm going to be more intentional when I go into meetings or I work with that person, because I know them, they know me, and we're going to be working together more harmoniously. So it definitely provides direct and indirect benefits.
I've got more questions coming into the chat room, which I appreciate you doing that, everyone. Okay, let's see. What are your thoughts on using exit interviews as a way of improving recruitment and retention?
So, in my experiences, I work with a lot of human resource, executives. And I mean, exit interviews are, I think, one of those, I mean, in my opinion, one of those kind of like fundamentals of a best practice from an HR, standpoint. A lot of times, every practice has some inherent limitations, and, an exit interview is typically, you're only going to get what the individual is willing to reveal, right? So sometimes they're candid, and sometimes they're not, because they want to protect the relationship because of any other implications, right? So there, I think it's good, but it's limited.
Do you have an example or an illustration of using data-based assessment in a nonprofit setting?
Oh, yeah. Michelle, I believe you have a great example. We just finished.
Actually, I kind of do. I forgot about that. So we did talk about that. There was a situation a couple of months ago where an organization really needed to fill a position. And there was a fair amount of urgency about it. And they had a candidate. The team that was doing the interviewing and the evaluation had, you could just tell by talking to them, they had some gut feeling concerns about this individual. So they decided to go forward with an assessment. And I don't want to say that the assessment was the reason that they made the decision, but it made them confident in not hiring that individual. And it was like the classic ugly chair scenario. You know, the person would have gotten there and I guess it would have been okay. But honestly, there was probably a good chance that within a year, they would be thinking, how do we get out of this situation? So they decided to put the time in to find the right person for the position.
And that would have been a very costly decision, obviously, right? Just because of the fact that if the higher you go in the organization, the more of a risk is associated with a bad hire, right? Because of all the implications there. So.
Okay, I'm scrolling through the chats. I just want to make sure I've got everyone's question. Hold on, there is a question, but I'm not really sure I understand it. It's from Jesse. He or she is asking capacity building funding. What are the metrics that would be helpful for capacity building funding? Okay, I'm going to take a guess at what we're trying to get at here is how would an organization decide what is appropriate to budget for things like, for this type of a function, for stepping up your recruitment game in the ways that we've talked about today?
So Michelle, I mean,
yeah, I know. I'm trying to think it through too. But like, how would you decide how would you decide what is an appropriate level to budget for each organization?
Yeah, so if I think I understand the question, I'll offer what I think could be the answer.
Yeah,
but,
I'm
right?
kind of with you there.
So a lot of times, the money is already being expended due to the fact that there's lost productivity in the role or the turnover costs and so on and so forth. So if we have a hard metric in terms of what the current turnover rate is now, then that's what we want to work towards improving, because then as you employ a tool or solution that has a fee associated with it,
right.
You would hope that it would then kind of like counterbalance the costs that are going out, right? And then eventually be a positive ROI. So we'd have to have that conversation and work on that. But basically what we do from an assessment standpoint, and I've heard this from working with a lot of different organizations from small to enterprise, is what we do. It's a very cost-effective implementation solution. So it oftentimes proves to provide a high degree of ROI.
Oh, thank you. All right, listen, it's after 2 o'clock. I know people have to get back to their lives and their jobs. We will be circulating the recording, which will include the slides, also with a very interesting white paper from Talexes. And that will include an opportunity to contact us if you want to talk more about a particular recruitment issue, or you have other questions about what we've talked about today. We will be very happy to schedule time with you to talk more about that. Anthony, I want to thank you so much. Every time you go through those slides, I just feel like I learned something else that's really important and useful, and that I'm going to hang on to.
My pleasure.
I want to thank everyone else for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you digitally all on the 27th. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.